After months of being mocked for my useless job, my parents told me, "Starting next month, you'll pay to live here." I smiled, packed my bag, and left without a word. The following week, I got a text from Dad. "The mortgage is due. Where are you?" I, 26M, never thought I'd be the one to walk out on my family. But here I was, loading the last of my belongings into my decade-old sedan at 3 in the morning. The house behind me was dark, silent, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. My job as a data analyst for a small environmental consulting firm had been the subject of endless mockery at family dinners for the past 6 months. Mom would sigh dramatically whenever I mentioned work, asking when I'd get a real job like my cousin who sold insurance. Dad would laugh and tell his friends I played with spreadsheets all day while real men built things. My younger brother, still in college and funded entirely by our parents, would smirk and ask if I'd calculated how much of a disappointment I was. What they didn't know was that I'd been paying their mortgage for the past 8 months. It started last March when Dad pulled me aside after dinner, his face grave, and explained that his contracting business had hit a rough patch. Some clients hadn't paid, and he was short on the mortgage for a few months. He asked if I could help, just temporarily, until things picked up. He promised to pay me back, and I agreed without hesitation. Family was family, after all. The first payment of $3,000 came out of my savings. Then the second. By the 4th month, I'd started dipping into the emergency fund I'd been building since college. Dad kept promising the money was coming, that a big job was about to close, that he just needed a little more time. Mom never mentioned it, but I assumed Dad had told her. I kept paying, kept helping, kept being the dependable son. Meanwhile, the mockery intensified. Dad started calling my job, playing computer, at family gatherings. Mom told her book club I was wasting my expensive education on meaningless work. My brother openly laughed when I mentioned a successful project I'd completed, asking if I'd gotten a gold star sticker for my efforts. Their friends would ask what I did, and before I could answer, one of my parents would jump in with some dismissive comment about data entry or internet surfing. I tried to brush it off. I reminded myself I was helping them, that they were stressed about money, that they didn't really mean it. But each comment cut deeper, especially knowing what I was sacrificing for them. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in September. I'd just gotten home from a particularly long day at work, having secured a major contract for my firm that came with a substantial bonus I wouldn't see for another month. I was exhausted but proud, and foolishly, I thought I might share the news with my family. Dad was in his recliner watching television when I walked in. Mom was in the kitchen preparing dinner. My brother was at the dining table, supposedly studying, but mostly scrolling through his phone. I mentioned that I'd had a good day at work, and Dad muted the television. He turned to me with that look I'd learned to dread, the one that meant he was about to say something he thought was hilarious. He announced that starting next month, I'd need to start paying rent if I wanted to keep living there. $500 a month, he said, because I was a grown man with a job, even if it was a useless one, and it was time I contributed to the household. I stood there, frozen, my work bag still hanging from my shoulder. Mom agreed from the kitchen, saying it was only fair, that I couldn't expect to live there for free forever. My brother laughed and said maybe now I'd finally move out and stop being such a burden. Something inside me went very quiet and very cold. I asked Dad if he was serious, and he said of course he was serious. Did I think I could just coast through life without responsibilities? I was 26 years old, he reminded me, not some teenager. Mom added that they'd been more than generous letting me stay there rent-free for so long, that other parents charged their adult children from the moment they got their first job. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, but they didn't seem to notice. I told them that was completely fair and reasonable. I said I'd start looking for a place right away. Dad nodded, looking satisfied, and unmuted his show. Mom went back to stirring something on the stove. My brother had already returned to his phone. I went upstairs to my room and started packing. It took me 3 hours to sort through everything I owned and decide what to take immediately versus what to leave behind. I worked quietly, methodically, filling boxes and suitcases with clothes, documents, electronics, and anything of value. My childhood bedroom had become a storage space over the years, filled with things I'd accumulated but never properly organized. Now, in the middle of the night, I was ruthlessly efficient. At 2 in the morning, I started carrying boxes to my car. The house was silent, everyone asleep. It took 6 trips to load everything I needed immediately. I left behind furniture, some old books, and childhood memorabilia that no longer mattered. In my room, I left an envelope on my stripped bed. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 8 months of dates and a number next to each. $3,000, repeated 8 times. At the bottom, I'd written the total, $24,000. Below that, a simple sentence explaining these were the mortgage payments I'd been making since March, as requested. I added that I considered this my contribution to the household and wished them well. I didn't mention rent. I didn't ask for the money back. I just stated the facts. I pulled out of the driveway at 3:15 in the morning and drove to an extended stay hotel I'd looked up on my phone. I checked in, hauled my most essential boxes inside, and collapsed on the bed as the sun started to rise. The first call came at 7:30. Dad's name flashed on my phone screen. I declined it and turned off my phone. I slept until noon, woke up feeling disoriented but strangely light, and finally powered my phone back on to find 17 missed calls and 32 text messages. The messages from Mom started concerned, asking where I was and if I was okay. They quickly turned accusatory, demanding I come home immediately and explain myself. Dad's messages were angry from the start, ordering me to return and calling me disrespectful and ungrateful. My brother sent a single message asking if I'd really left and calling me dramatic. I ignored them all. Instead, I called my firm's HR department and asked about corporate housing assistance. I'd been with the company for 4 years and had never used any of my relocation benefits. The HR representative was helpful and understanding, and by the end of the day, I had information on several apartment complexes near the office that offered corporate discounts. The next morning, I toured 3 apartments and put down a deposit on a studio in a decent neighborhood. It was small but clean, with good light and updated appliances. I'd be able to move in within a week. I spent the afternoon setting up mail forwarding and updating my address with my bank, employer, and various services. My phone continued to explode with messages. I read them but didn't respond. Mom was cycling between anger and guilt tripping, saying I was tearing the family apart over a simple request to pay rent. Dad was getting increasingly aggressive, demanding I return immediately and accusing me of theft for taking my belongings. My brother sent a few more messages, mostly confusion mixed with his usual mockery. None of them mentioned the envelope. None of them acknowledged the mortgage payments. For days after I left, I received a text from Dad that was different from the others. It was early morning, and the message was short. He asked where I was, said they needed to talk, and mentioned that the mortgage payment was due next week. I stared at that message for a long time. The mortgage he'd been paying with my money. The mortgage he'd asked me to help with while calling my job useless. The mortgage he apparently expected me to continue covering while also charging me rent. I typed out a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, I sent back a simple message. I was staying at an extended stay hotel and would be moving into my own apartment in 3 days. I told him I'd left a detailed accounting of my contributions to the household in an envelope on my bed, and that I wouldn't be making any further mortgage payments. His response came within seconds, asking what I meant by that, demanding I explain. Then another message. Had I been paying their mortgage? Why hadn't I said anything? Another. They needed to discuss this immediately. Could I come home? I turned off my phone again. Moving into the apartment was surprisingly easy. I'd accumulated less than I thought over the years, and the studio was perfectly sized for my needs. My signing bonus from the new contract hit my account the day after I moved in, a substantial cushion that made me feel secure for the first time in months. I blocked my family's numbers. It felt extreme, but I needed space to think, to process, to figure out who I was without their constant judgment. I threw myself into work, taking on additional projects and staying late at the office. My colleagues noticed the change in my energy, and my supervisor pulled me aside to say whatever I was doing, I should keep it up. 3 weeks after I left, I received an email from Mom to my work address, which I hadn't thought to block. She begged me to call her, said we needed to talk as a family, that they'd had no idea I was paying the mortgage, that Dad had never told her. She said they were struggling, that Dad's business still hadn't recovered, that they might lose the house. She said I was their son, and didn't that mean anything to me? I felt a pang of guilt, then reminded myself of every mocking comment, every dismissive laugh, every time they'd made me feel worthless while I was literally keeping a roof over their heads. I didn't respond. Another week passed. I settled into a routine, started going to a gym near my apartment, reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the months of supporting my family. I felt younger, lighter, like I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged. Then came the email from my brother. It was longer than any communication I'd ever received from him, and the tone was different. He apologized for the way he'd treated me, said he'd been an idiot, that he hadn't known about the mortgage payments. He explained that Mom and Dad had been fighting constantly, that Dad had apparently told Mom he'd been handling the mortgage with money from a business loan, not my payments. He said Dad had been scrambling to cover the payments and was now 2 months behind. The bank had sent a notice. They were scared. He said I didn't owe them anything, that he understood if I never wanted to speak to them again, but he wanted me to know he was sorry. He said he looked up to me, even though he'd never shown it, and that he was ashamed of how he'd acted. He hoped I was doing well. That one got to me. I sat in my apartment, reading and rereading that email, feeling something crack in the wall I'd built around my anger. My brother was still a kid in many ways, still figuring things out, still influenced by our parents' attitudes. His apology felt genuine. I wrote back. I thanked him for reaching out and told him I accepted his apology. I explained that I'd needed to leave for my own well-being, that the constant mockery while I was supporting the family financially had become unbearable. I told him I hoped he'd learn to value all kinds of work, not just what our parents deemed worthy. I said I didn't know if I'd reconcile with Mom and Dad, but that I appreciated him taking the time to reach out. His response came quickly. He asked if we could meet for coffee sometime, and I surprised myself by agreeing. We met at a cafe near my office 2 days later. He looked tired, older than I remembered. He apologized again in person, and I could see he meant it. He told me more about what was happening at home, the stress, the arguments, the way Dad had finally admitted he'd been counting on my payments to cover the mortgage. He said Mom was furious at Dad for lying to her and embarrassed that she'd been complaining about me to her friends while I was supporting the family. I asked if they were going to lose the house, and he said he didn't know. Dad was trying to get a loan modification, selling equipment from his business, picking up any work he could find. Mom had started working part-time at a friend's boutique. They were cutting expenses everywhere. Part of me felt vindicated. A larger part felt exhausted. I told my brother I wasn't coming back, that I couldn't go back to living in a house where I was constantly belittled. He nodded and said he understood. We talked for over an hour about his classes, my work, what he wanted to do after graduation. It was the first real conversation we'd had in years. As we were leaving, he asked if I'd ever consider talking to Mom and Dad again. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that I needed more time, that they'd hurt me deeply and consistently. He accepted that, gave me an awkward hug, and promised to stay in touch. 2 months after I left, I received a letter in the mail at my apartment, forwarded from my old address. It was from Dad, handwritten on notebook paper. His handwriting, usually bold and assertive, looked shaky. He apologized. He said he'd been wrong to mock my work, wrong to take my help for granted, wrong to ask me for rent while I was paying his mortgage. He said he'd been embarrassed about his business failing and had taken it out on me. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him, but he wanted me to know he was sorry and that he was proud of me, even if he'd never shown it. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask me to come home. He just apologized. I set the letter on my kitchen counter and left it there for a week, occasionally reading it again. I talked to my brother, who confirmed Dad had written it himself, that no one had forced him. I talked to a therapist I'd started seeing, working through the complicated feelings of anger, guilt, relief, and grief for the family relationship I'd thought I had. Eventually, I wrote back. I kept it short. I said I accepted his apology, but needed more time before I could consider rebuilding our relationship. I said I hoped his business recovered and that they were able to keep the house, but that I wouldn't be providing financial support. I said if he wanted to stay in contact, he could email me, and maybe eventually we could talk. His response came 2 weeks later. He thanked me, said he understood, and promised to respect my boundaries. He included a money order for $3,000, with a note saying it was the first installment on paying me back. He said it might take years, but he would pay back every dollar. I deposited the check and put the money into savings. I didn't know if he'd actually follow through with more payments, but the gesture meant something. 3 months later, I got promoted at work. My environmental data analysis had helped the firm land several major contracts, and they created a new senior analyst position specifically for me, complete with a substantial raise. I moved into a bigger apartment, started dating someone I met through friends, and slowly built a life that felt entirely my own. My brother and I met for coffee every few weeks. He'd started standing up to our parents more, questioning their judgments and biases. He told me he'd decided to pursue environmental science in graduate school, partially inspired by hearing me talk about my work with actual interest for the first time. Mom sent occasional emails, usually short, sometimes apologetic, sometimes just checking in. I responded to some and ignored others, depending on how I felt. We weren't close, but we were civil. Dad sent a money order every month, $3,000 each time. After 6 months, I received an email from him saying his business had stabilized and he wanted to increase the payments to pay me back faster. I told him to keep it at $3,000 and focus on getting ahead on his own bills. A year after I left, my brother graduated from college. He invited me to the ceremony, and I went. I sat with an aunt and uncle, not with my parents, but I was there. I watched him walk across the stage and felt proud. Afterward, at a family dinner I'd agreed to attend, Mom hugged me and thanked me for coming. Dad shook my hand and asked about my work without any mockery in his voice. It was awkward and strange and not fully healed, but it was something. I left early, citing work the next day, but before I went, my brother pulled me aside. He thanked me for coming, then said something that stuck with me. He told me that watching me leave had taught him that he didn't have to accept being treated poorly, even by family. He said I'd shown him what self-respect looked like. Driving home to my apartment, I realized I'd been angry for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just be free. Free from judgment, from obligation, from the weight of supporting people who didn't value what I was giving. The anger was still there, probably would be for a long time, but it was quieter now, manageable. I never moved back home. I never resumed paying their mortgage. But slowly, carefully, I started to rebuild something with my family, on my terms this time. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before, and it never would be. But it was honest, and that was enough.